Welcome, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Hey,
So, this is this unusual part of Genesis where we are talking about a mitzvah, and specifically the mitzvah of circumcision. And generally speaking, when we get into mitzvot, there's a lot more Torah T'mimah than when we're just working with narrative. And so we are
call
carefully
from Harriet Rabbins.
sorry? Okay. So, so at any rate, part of the reason is that the mitzvot represent a connection that we have with our divine creator. That being able to find significance in our own lives by feeling that we are stewards in a very specific kind of way in performing these mitzvot. And so the desire of the tradition, certainly we start seeing it within the rabbinic work, is to dissect and deconstruct and try to understand all the possibilities that might inhere in a given particular mitzvah. And Torah T'mimah does a great job in introducing us, getting us into that sort of framework, which the Talmud and the whole Talmudic enterprise goes into. So we're going to see, of course, as I said, I've said this, I realize this, that it all has to do with circumstances and the application of ideals. And by the way, when we say the Shema, we are my best interpretation that I have is that we are declaring to our ancestor Jacob that we are committed to the same relationship to our divine creator, just as he did as well. And that relationship is based upon the idea of performing divine commandments and understanding what a privilege it is to be able to do such a thing and to try and perfect it as much as we can, given our own circumstances. So this verse, Himol, Yimol, Yelid Beitcha, Umiknat Kaspecha, right? So there's this doubling of you shall circumcise, right? Milah has to do with circumcision. So the fact that it's doubled here means we have to now try to understand what are the implications of this expression, Himol, Yimol, right? Yelid Beitcha, we've already discussed that, right? One born of your household, Umiknat Kaspecha, one purchased through your money. V'haita, and my briti, my covenant, shall be b'vsarchim, in your flesh, levrit olam, as an eternal covenant. So you can see from the language, if you sort of draw in the implications of the language here, how profound this mitzvah really is. So let's take a look at this, right? Himol, Yimol. So Himol, Yimol, the fact that it's doubled up like that, lerabot, so understanding why the necessity to add an emphasis on this, it's to include. Lerabot means to include. Tzitzin, the threads of skin, hama'akvin et hamilah, which would invalidate the circumcision. In other words, normally if we think about circumcision, we think of simply removing the foreskin. But what this is saying is that in reality, when you're actually performing circumcision, inevitably there are certain threads of skin that still adhere when you've removed the foreskin, and that they have to be removed as well to validate, to say that the circumcision is in fact a brit milah, that it fulfills the requirements of it being a brit. And this is in Tractate Yevamot, page 72a. Let's take a look now. So he's explaining these nimin, right? He says, Heim nimei haor. They're the threads of skin, shenish aru medubakim mehaorla, which remain attached from the foreskin baha'atara on the corona of the penis. Dekevan, that since adain medubakim, right, since they're still adhering, hem eno nechshav kemahul adain. So in other words, because these threads of skin are still adhering, you cannot say that it was a complete circumcision, that he is in fact circumcised. וגם לעניין שבת, right? דוחה העטרה, הסרת התסיסין. And he says, it's such an important element, such a necessary element of the operation, that even on Shabbat, right, where we've discussed this already in a previous lesson, we discussed the fact that we have a conflict of laws when it comes to circumcision on the Shabbat, that's an interesting situation. And so there are circumstances essentially where it says, if it is the eighth day and the circumcision is performed on the eighth day, it's such an important part of that ceremony, or of that mitzvah, that even though it's on Shabbat, where you're not allowed to perform shechita of any kind, you nevertheless, it overrides the Shabbat and you perform circumcision. However, if for some reason the circumcision is not taking place on the eighth day, but on the ninth day or the 10th day, there may be circumstances where in fact that might happen, right? Then it does not override the Shabbat. It's only because of the fact that it has to happen on the eighth day, if possible, right? So even the removal of these threads are also part of it. And so what he's saying is they also override the Shabbat, right? And even if he in fact has thought he was completed, he might have, when you're actually involved, your hands are engaged in that process, right? Even if he took his hands away thinking that perhaps he had completed that process, nevertheless, he has to go back and make sure that those threads are removed, even on Shabbat, is the point that he's making. All right? So the himo, looking at these words and seeing how we interpret those words. Now, this is interesting. I hope you find this interesting, and I'll do the best I can to make sure that we can understand the argumentation going on here. Yimol. Yimol lerabot. So now it's to include afilu me'apamim, even if you have to go and you have to maybe return and re-circumcise or complete the circumcision even 100 times. It has to be done right. It's simply the ma'apamim 100 times is not necessarily to be taken literally. The point of that is simply saying it must be done correctly. It must be a complete removal. Remez, this is an allusion, lemashuch, to one who is who draws he's going to explain what mashuch is, shechayav limol, that he is again going to have to circumcise himself. All right, so I'll go straight to the Torah T'mimah because he explains what a mashuch is. Okay, let's take a look. Here, Hamashuch, I'll make this a little bit bigger. There we go. Hu mahu, a mashuch is one who has been circumcised, shenimshecha orlato, where nevertheless, there may be parts of the foreskin, right? Not actually of the foreskin itself, but of the skin of the penis that somehow got expanded, vikista ha'atara, and wound up covering the corona. Now, there is, in fact, historically, there's a time, especially during the Greek period, where they used to perform athletics naked. The men used to be naked, and they made fun of Jews who were circumcised, and there were Jews who intentionally tried to recover, right, the corona of their penis because they felt so ashamed and wanted to be like everybody else. That's the idea of mashuch, where they intentionally did that. They tried to stretch the skin. Umi deoraita. What's interesting is what he adds is that according to the biblical commandment, right, because we make a distinction between deoraita, in other words, a mitzvah that we say is in fact biblical, right? That's deoraita. And de Rabbanan, we make that distinction from a rabbinic decree, which is something that the rabbis added to protect. We in the tradition, we understand the rabbis to have the authority, sages, in other words, people who have sufficient knowledge and commitment of Torah to create edicts, we could call them, that help to protect and have validity regarding our responsibility to perform commandments. So he's saying this particular mitzvah is not, it's a no chayav limol shenit. He says, biblically speaking, he is not obligated to get recircumcised. Rak midirabanan, there's that term, midirabanan, only on the basis of what the rabbis teach. Mipnei shenir'eh ka'arel. And the reason is because even though he did have Brit Milah performed, but now he looks like a uncircumcised person. And arel is a Hebrew word that means we don't have an English equivalent. We have to use the negation of circumcised. But arel means someone who is uncircumcised. V'hadrasha bazeh, and he says, and the interpretation that we've made, right? The inference we've made regarding this, he asmachta ba'alma. It is only considered a support. It isn't a proof. In other words, we have, again, because there's such a deep process of developing Jewish law in intensely looking at the biblical text regarding mitzvot, that we make a distinction between something we think or we consider to be a logical deduction. If it's a logical deduction, and some of you may be familiar with the 13 principles of Rabbi Yishmael, where he actually tells you, he states what the logical inferences are, which means that anything that can be deducted logically from Torah statements, that is has as much, it's as biblically obligatory as if it were stated explicitly in the Torah. So it doesn't have to be stated explicitly, but if it's a logical deduction, then it's as if it was stated explicitly. However, there's also other deductions that are not logical, but are supportive, like this one. And he's going to go on a little bit. And so those are considered asmachta. They do not have the severity, maybe I can say, of Torah commandments. What's the practical distinction? With the Torah commandments, the punishments for violating negative commandments in the Torah are mandated in the Torah as to what they are. However, if you violate a rabbinic commandment, the punishment essentially is stripes. In other words, flogging. But that is the only punishment if it's going to be carried out for violating rabbinic commandments. So that's a practical element there. But I will tell you this discussion about, the strength of rabbinic commandments, etc., and whether or not one is obligated, to the degree to which one is obligated to fulfill rabbinic commandments. And there's arguments that say precisely because the temptation is to say, oh, that's just rabbinic, that in some ways the obligation is even greater to fulfill them, to make sure you fulfill them. So just food for thought, right? And for this reason, ein ze ela remes, and for that reason, we consider this verse, right, the proof coming from this verse, merely an allusion, a remes, kamosh takdu b'miskar, and that's in fact why he put the word remes in muskar, means the square brackets. You notice here's the word remes. So it's not necessarily in the Gemara, right? Because he does take, the Torah T'mimah does take what's written in the Gemara and other rabbinic material and try to frame it in a way that's easier to understand. Okay. Here we go. Sorry, Ann. Okay, let me find it. Right. V'chein, and likewise, bisamuch, later on, pasuk yudalad, in verse 14. Ba'agamkin dasha, there's going to be another interpretation, lerabot hamashuch, to include someone who has pulled the skin over the corona. V'hu gamkin asmachta, beremes, and that too is not a mitzvah deoraita. It is, however, an asmachta. It's considered to be support and an allusion in that particular case. Next little piece. Himol, yimol. Right, again, this doubling of the word, right? It's telling us, it's drawing our attention to this particular mitzvah and saying how important it is. And so we're looking at how we express the importance of this mitzvah. Itmar, it is stated, minayin lemila, from where do we derive the commandment regarding circumcision, ba'oved kochavim, shehib sula, that if a non-Jew, right, performs the circumcision, it is not valid. It's an invalid Brit Milah. It doesn't count as a Brit Milah. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, so said Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan is this very important authority himself. He's a Palestinian, and it's called Palestine because that's what the Romans called it, right? Amora, okay, and he said himol. That's the verse. So let's take a look. And this is in Avodah Zarah, page 27a. Let's see what he has to say. Okay, let's find it. Here we are. Yitachen, it would appear, the Darish Hamila Himol, that he is interpreting this word Himol, right, of Himol, Behipuch Utiot, in transferring the letters to Mahul. In other words, instead of Himol, he's reading it as Mahul Himol. In other words, one who has been circumcised. We find this kind of drush quite often in the interpretations of our rabbis, our sages of blessed memory, where they'll take a word and they may transpose a letter and get a different halacha from it. And what he wants to say is, Mi shehu ma'ul, yimol. In other words, that the implication of this verse is one who is circumcised, he is the one who can perform a circumcision. If you yourself aren't circumcised, you should not be performing circumcisions. Now, the question here, which isn't going to be discussed, right, is, well, what if the non-Jew is circumcised? Does it mean, would he have to be circumcised for the sake of a brit, or is it simply an issue of the operation itself? It's a question that I would have to say that quite possibly there might be a distinction in the fact that clearly, since a non-Jew is not obligated to perform mitzvot, and this is a mitzvah, that it would not be valid on that basis. The distinction might be, and I'm totally speculating here, is that, however, let's say that the non-Jew is the only person who has the expertise to perform a circumcision. In other words, there are no Jews around who are capable of performing circumcisions successfully, but you do have a non-Jew who's a physician and who knows how to do it, right? That if, in fact, he were to do it under the supervision of a Jewish person, and he himself is circumcised, that would be a valid circumcision. Now, that might be the distinction. However, if the physician himself, the non-Jewish physician, isn't circumcised, it wouldn't count. But that would be a little bit of a distinction that I might be able to suggest in regarding this. But not having any proof anywhere in that regard, you have to simply take it as a speculation on my part. So, for informational purposes only, right? Ula el, and above, But pasuk tet in verse 9, ba'ad rasha acheret b'inyan zeh. We have a different interpretation regarding this matter of one who is circumcised. Only one who is circumcised can perform a circumcision. Meha pasuk, from the verse that says, Va'ata, and as for you, et briti tishmor, you shall guard my covenant. Ata, and we understood by this, so there's the verses in the Torah, right? And we said, Ata ukos keyotze bacha. In other words, you, Abraham, and your offspring, right? Yen Sham Be'ur, we already did in fact discuss this, right? And there we have the clarification and Torah T'mimah's comments, etc. Umivu arba Gemara, right? And it's clarified in the Gemara, in the Talmud, nafka mina bein halimudim, that there actually is a practical halachic difference between these two different verses, and although it seems like we're deriving the same idea. Le'inyan isha, having to do with a woman. So the question is now becoming, if a woman performs the circumcision, is it a valid circumcision, right? That's the question. De laman de amar, because according to the one who says, min va'ata ve'et briti tishmor, that if he derives this idea from the verse that says, and as for you, you shall guard my covenant, isha lav bat brit milahi. We know that we don't perform circumcisions on women. So in other words, in that case, a woman would not be allowed to perform a valid circumcision. Ulemad damar mahu yimol, but if you're learning it from the concept of one who is circumcised shall perform the circumcision, isha, we have to say that a woman is kaman de mehila damya, right? We have to say that a woman is just like someone who is circumcised. Okay? And that, of course, we realize. Okay, why do we say that? Because she doesn't have, in fact, right? It doesn't make sense. She doesn't have that kind of foreskin to circumcise. We don't, there's no concept of it. It doesn't apply. The mitzvah doesn't apply to her. Ve'iyein od besugya uvetosafot. And he says you can look this even further in the sugya means in the Talmud reference, in the Talmud itself, uvetosafot, and tosafot meaning we know Rashi's grandchildren who are major commentators on the Gemara. Vehine, and look at this, okay, indeed, kaimalan, right, ladina, right, we actually hold that halachically, and ladina, I was having, there's two ways of understanding ladina, right? The din, you can understand din as meaning referring to a mitzvah, but you can also learn the word ladina as dan, meaning to judge or to logically deduce. And I had to really play around with both those possibilities. In other words, kaima landadina, we could say, is it appears logical, right? We hold, and consequently halachically, the ishak sheira limo, that a woman is in fact fit to perform circumcisions, right? Based on that second interpretation. V'chein, right? And for this reason, mesamchinan b'Gemara, we actually have, we rely in the Gemara, heter zeh, this particular permissibility for a woman to perform circumcisions, al ha-pasuk, based on the verse, the Parshat Shemot that we find in the Parsha of Shemot of Exodus, where it says, quote, "V'tikach tziporat sor." It says, and Tzipora, Moses' wife, took a flint, v'tichrat et orlat b'na, and she removed the foreskin of her son. There we are. There's a woman performing a circumcision. Well, it seems like a pretty compelling proof. So how do those people who hold that a woman is not valid to perform a circumcision? Here we go. Uman desfira laho de isha psula limo, and according to those people who hold the opinion that a woman is not fit to, well, I'm sorry, it's not a valid circumcision, right? Some Svirale, they argue that in that particular case, Tzipporah started the circumcision, Moshe Gamar, and Moses completed the circumcision. And there's a principle that you say that the mitzvah goes, in other words, how can I put it? The benefit or we attribute the mitzvah to the one who completes it. In other words, if we're saying who performed the mitzvah, it is performed by the person who completes the mitzvah. Okay, so in that case, a man completed the mitzvah. May not be the most compelling argument in the world, but there it is. Uva Yoredea, and now we're going to the Shulchan Aruch, right? In the section of the Shulchan Aruch called Yoredea, which deals with mitzvot that require a level of expertise to perform, and you have to have a level of expertise to perform Brit Milah, to perform circumcisions. Siman Reish Samach Dalet, this is, in other words, this is chapter 264, Seif Aleph, that is paragraph 1, Katvu, there they wrote in the Yoredea, in the Shulchan Aruch, Ha'isha kshera limo. It says, a woman is kasher, it is valid, she can, in fact, perform circumcisions. Ve'im yesh Yisrael gadol, however, if there is an adult Israelite, right, bar mitzvah, shiodei limo, that who knows how to perform circumcisions, who kodem, he precedes her. In other words, we go with the man. We have a preference of having the man perform the circumcision, even though the woman's, if she does perform the circumcision, it's a valid circumcision. So the question is going to be later on, is this a minhag? We can't say this is a mitzvah per se. We can say it's saying that that's the custom. The custom is to have an adult male perform it. The Katav HaRama, and in the Rama is Moshe Isserles, who wrote the Mapa, right? He is the Shulchan Aruch was written by a Sephardic Jew, and the Rama puts in glosses into the Shulchan Aruch to bring it in line with Ashkenazic practice. This is what he said, V'zeh Lashono, quote, V'yesh omrim, there are those who say, the Isha lo timo, that a woman should not, in fact, perform circumcision. V'chein nohagin, so there's the minhag, and this is, in fact, the custom, lahader achar ish, in other words, that it's, again, when he's saying lo timo, he's not saying that it's pasul. He's just saying it's not appropriate. The custom is not to have a woman perform the circumcision and to give preference to a man. In other words, lahader, again, is hidur mitzvah. In other words, to make the mitzvah more beautiful, more appropriate, however you want to say it, right, by having a man perform it. Adkan, end of quote. V'hashach, right, the Siftei Kohen, v'hagra, this is Elijah of Vilna, right, the two different other major authorities. Tamhu, they were surprised. They expressed surprise, al devarav, regarding the words of the Ramah. Dahagam svara rishona modeh, because if you look at the very statement in the Shulchan Aruch, right, it says there, if there is an adult male who knows, we should give preference. It already says it. So what's he saying, right? Uma mosifu. So what is he adding here? Why does the Ramah have to say this? Ye'uyam sham, check it out. V'nir'eh, and it would appear, the kavanat harama, that the intention of the Ramah, the reason he wrote this, de mechuyavim gam lachazor achar ish, right? That he's saying that one is obligated to go after a man, to find a man to perform the circumcision under these circumstances. He's saying, what he's trying to say is that even if at the time we don't have a man ready to perform the circumcision, we need to check into it. We need to look around to see if we can find a man to do it, even if we don't know of one one who's handy at the time. Masha Enokain, right? This would not appear to be the opinion. The Mechaber is a reference to Joseph Caro, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, right? In other words, there's a subtle distinction between the two. And Joseph Caro would say, Rak im yeshno lefanenu. We're saying, the way Joseph Caro is saying, is that only if we have someone present, Mizuman, he's right and ready to do it, who could him? In that case, we give him preference. But in a case, if we don't have one that we know who's an adult male who's capable of doing it, the woman goes ahead and does it. She's kasher, right? And on the other hand, the Ramah is saying, no, you need to take trouble. You need to go a step further to find a man to perform the circumcision. Aval ein mechuyavin lachazor alav. So this is the Ramah again, the Ramah's position. The Shulchan Aruch, Joseph Kara's and Mechaber's position. One isn't obligated to have to search for him. V'hainu tama, right? And this is the rationale. Dida'at harama, that the opinion of the Ramah, ladun lehat okay, and it is usually the opinion, right, to go machmir, to be more punctilious, right, more strict, kehaposkim, like those of those arbiters of halacha, the ishap sula lamol. So he's following the people, he's tending to follow that opinion that said that a woman is not capable, right? The mitzvah will not count if a woman performs the circumcision. And for this reason, despite the fact that one doesn't delay a circumcision on its correct time, meaning referring the Shabbat, right? Bishvilze, right? One does not delay if you can't find a man to perform the circumcision on the Shabbat, right? One is not supposed to push it away. You're not supposed to delay the circumcision. Mishum dahikar ledina, right? Because the main opinions of the halachic arbiters, leheter isha lemol, is to allow a woman to, in fact, perform it. Yes, Harlan, did you have a comment? Let me keep going. Nevertheless, be'oto hayom, on that very day, in other words, if it's Shabbat and one has to perform the circumcision on the Shabbat, mechuyavim lachazor acharei ish. Nevertheless, even though it's okay for a woman to be performing it on Shabbat, one still has to, in fact, try to see if you can find a man, latzet da'at hamachmirim, in other words, so as to satisfy the opinion of those people who are machmir, who do not allow it, who have the opinion, who say that a woman doesn't perform circumcisions. So that way you can kind of cross both lines there. And I'm going to stop here. We'll continue this tomorrow in terms of this. As you can see, he has a lot to say about this subject, understandably, because there's differences of opinion. Let me see if I can take this around and mark our spot. Here, right here. Okay, I'm going to stop the share and take any comments.
Yeah.
I've lost Judith. I've lost a bunch of people.
Well, it's 10:04, so maybe people.
Yes.
8:04.
Right.
I was wondering, Rabbi.
Yes.
I was wondering if you're in the hospital and you're having a baby and you have a female doctor, pediatrician delivering that baby, and you can't find a man to do the circumcision. Can that doctor do the circumcision because she knows how to do it? But she's a woman.
Right. That is exactly the issue that we're dealing with. And I think what we're saying is, yes, if she's the only person available to do it on the eighth day, because it's such a mitzvah to perform it on the eighth day, she can do it. Okay.
Is
So,
that a mitzvah? You still get the mitzvah?
yes, yes.
Oh,
The only thing is that you have to be able to say, well, I tried to find a man to do it, a Jewish man to do it, and
of
I
course.
couldn't find a Jewish man to do it because how many Jewish men are actually capable of performing circumcisions? Not very many. I
So
tried. Yes. I'm sorry,
I have a
Lauren?
question.
Yes.
Since the Brit Milah ritual is supposed to bring the baby into the covenant,
Yes.
um, and I know that obviously girls can't be circumcised, but during conversion or
Yes.
when they're a baby,
Yes.
what brings them to the covenant? Just blessings without
Are
are
you
they
talking about
similar blessings
are you talking
or
about for girls or for boys?
girls either at conversion or as babies? Or
Baby
do they not?
girls? Baby
Yeah,
girls?
girls.
Yeah, I mean, they are part of it regardless, right? Because as you can see, the tradition would say they are circumcised. By the way, sadly, there are places, I believe, in Africa where female circumcision is practiced.
But I'm not talking about
Yeah,
females being circumcised.
right.
I'm talking
No.
about is there some kind of um, blessing or
Ceremony, etc.
or some kind of, you
Yes.
know, something that's really kind of parallel.
Right. I think that is something that's more de Rabbanan, right? That is something, say, that the conservative movement had felt, and maybe initially the reform movement had felt that there was something lacking in the fact that there wasn't a ceremony for girls. So we do have baby namings, okay?
Yeah,
Um,
but that's not a ritual of bringing somebody into the covenant
no,
in
but
the
that's
same
because
way.
not the same way. But then on
I
the other
mean,
hand, yes. But my honest feeling is that that there is an understanding that being a Jewish woman, practicing as a Jewish woman, makes you part of the covenant.
okay, so it's just that you don't have,
You
yeah,
don't. They're
just
not requiring it. Okay. Look, you can say mitzvahs. You can look at mitzvahs in two ways. You can look at mitzvahs as obligations. You can also look at mitzvahs as privileges.
yeah.
And I
And
think in this case, it's seen as an obligation, right? And that women they're not obligated to do it because, as he says, they're considered already circumcised. And I would say even more that just being circumcised isn't enough.
but when men are circumcised
Yes,
already and
yes.
then they convert,
Ah,
there's
yes.
a ritual.
Correct, correct.
But
Right.
when women convert, there's no
No,
ritual that brings
no,
them into
there's
the
no.
covenant other than just the mikveh and the
Correct,
yeah.
correct. Yes. And
And when
that's
they're a baby, there's nothing.
no, there isn't because girl babies are not circumcised.
I know,
At
but if
least
they could
not
be
practiced.
like dunked in a mikveh or something, some
Well,
kind of
Actually,
ritual
they
where
are. Well, not if they're converting, they are dunked in a
I'm
mikveh.
not talking about now conversion, I'm talking about a
Yeah,
newborn.
yeah.
i-
No,
i- if you
me.
look, well, I'm going to leave the spiritual and the covenant out of it for, between us and Hashem or the Lord.
Hmm.
It's a marker of your tribal affiliation, which is easily visible. And
Only
if you,
visible with your pants off.
well, but back in the olden days, pants were optional, you know? And,
Well, at least within certain
and,
societies,
and,
yes.
and these days, in some cases, it is as well. But not all that aside, no, it was a mark of being a member of a group, and women didn't have to have that kind of a physical manifestation.
Well, because they
And
weren't considered members of the group.
well, if you're going off to war, which is usually what the men do, then it's nice to have a marker to distinguish you from the other guys.
They're
And
not fighting in war naked.
well, if you capture somebody, is he one of us or is he somebody else? It's that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
I'm trying to put it back on a more primitive tribal basis than
I
one
mean,
which
but they
is
could have
about.
mandated a haircut in a certain way for women.
Well,
They
there are
just didn't consider them.
no, there are markers in various tribes, I'm sure, that are similar in terms of physical manifestations, but it just happens to be handy that
I'm
this is
talking
an
about our
area that you
tribe.
can check somebody to see if they're branded or not. That's all.
So I can tell you that when I was in South Africa, I met a gentleman who was Pondo, right? That's a tribe like Zulu. He was a
Okay.
Pondo. And I believe his left hand pinky was
Was
removed.
kind
This
of,
part
yeah,
was removed, right?
yeah.
And I asked him about it, and I'm trying to think of the way he said it, right? Oh, I remember what he said. He said, and I'm going to try and imitate his accent as best as I can. He had this beautiful accent, and he says, "It's a custom."
Well, there you
That's what he
are.
said. So just thought I should mention that to you because, in fact, there are other ways. Just
Of
not that I
signifying your
really want to
membership.
support you, Mead, all that much because,
No, I understand. You have
but I
other
want to
ways
be
of looking at
honest.
this.
Yes,
No,
there are. That is true.
but you know what we're seeing here is okay. The rabbis got a hold of this ritual and
Yeah.
they picked it up and they've run with it to the point where is it being done right or isn't it being done right? The fact
Right.
that there's a physical manifestation, that's not enough.
I just like the fact, I mean, that they are actually asking this question and that there is a halachic position that says
Yeah.
it's okay for women to perform this
Well,
on
sure.
a man. I
Yes.
think that's
Hmm.
pretty, in a sense, progressive.
Well, or you can say it was that way all the time, and they finally acknowledged the reality.
That I cannot speculate about.
That would be my take.
Okay,
Okay.
well, I
They
I owe you too
grudgingly
much to.
accepted it.
That's correct. I owe you too much to try to argue against you. Okay, I'm going to stop the
Okay.
recording.
Okay.
Okay. All right.